6. Henry Barnard. The Wheeling of the Spheres. Horace Mann, as against some contemporary opinion, that a difference in education is the sole cause of all the differences existing among men, held to the saner belief that there are certain substructures of temperament and disposition which education finds at the beginning of its work and which it can never wholly annul. It is significant that Mann felt it necessary to correct this opinion. It was widely held and symptomatic of the current Messianic expectations of education. Many persons, including some educators, were ready to assert this extreme claim, and while Mann himself differed with it, he had given acceptable and influential focus to the concept of educators as the new priesthood and the school as the true church and chosen ark. In his remarks at the dedication of the Massachusetts State Normal Schoolhouse at Bridgewater, August 19th, 1846, Mann declared, "There is oppression in the world which almost crushes the life out of humanity. There is deceit, which not only ensnares the unwary, but almost abolishes the security and confidence and delight which rational and social beings ought to enjoy in their intercourse with each other. There are wars, and the question whether they are right or wrong tortures the good man 1,000 times more than any successes or defeats of either belligerent. But the feeling which springs up spontaneously in my mind, and which I hope springs up spontaneously in your minds, my friends, in view of the errors and calamities and inequities of the race, is not to flee from the world, but to remain in it, not to hide away to forest solitudes or hermit cells, but to confront selfishness and wickedness and ignorance at whatever personal peril, and to subdue and extirpate them, or to die in the attempt. Had it not been for a feeling like this among your friends, and the friends of the sacred cause of education in which you have enlisted, you well know that the normal schools of Massachusetts would have been put down, and that this day would never have shone to gladden our hearts and to reward our toils and sacrifices. Let no man who knows not what has been suffered, what has been borne and forborne to bring to pass the present event, accuse me of an extravagance of joy. I believe normal schools to be a new instrumentality in the advancement of the race. I believe that without them, free schools themselves would be shorn of their strength and their healing power, and would at length become mere charity schools, and thus die out in fact and in form. Neither the art of printing, nor the trial by jury, nor a free press, nor free suffrage can long exist to any beneficial and salutary purpose without schools for the training of teachers, for if the character and qualifications of teachers be allowed to degenerate, the free schools will become pauper schools, and the pauper schools will produce pauper souls, and the free press will become a false and licentious press, and ignorant voters will become venal voters, and through the medium and guise of republican forms, an oligarchy of profligate and flagitious men will govern the land, nay, the universal diffusion and ultimate triumph of all glorious Christianity itself must await the time when knowledge shall be diffused among men through the instrumentality of good schools. Coiled up in this institution as in a spring, there is a vigour whose uncoiling may wheel the spheres. Referring to the gift of Edmund Dwight, pending an equal sum by the legislature for normal school establishment, Mann declared, "The time, the spot, the words of that conversation can never be erased from my soul. This day, triumphant over the past, auspicious for the future, then rose to my sight. By the auroral light of hope, I saw company after company go forth from the bosom of these institutions, like angel ministers, to spread abroad over waste spiritual realms the power of knowledge and the delights of virtue. Thank God the enemies who have since risen up to oppose and malign us did not cast their hideous shadows across that beautiful scene. The truth is, though it may seem a paradox to say so, The normal schools had to come to prepare a way from themselves and to show, by practical demonstration, what they were able to accomplish. Like Christianity itself, had they waited till the world at large called for them or was ready to receive them, they would never have come. This speech, in spirit like so many others dealing with normal schools, sets forth a neglected aspect of the 19th century educational philosophy, namely, its identification of the educational movement with teacher training and educational administration. Education, indeed, will accomplish great miracles, it was held, and reform the nation, but without the development of an educational hierarchy and cultus, these miracles could not occur. It should be noted that man, who enjoyed these things before the state schools and normal schools existed, believed that free schools, a free press, free suffrage, a free government, and indeed Christianity itself, required for their existence not merely the public or state school, but a state-trained corps of teachers, administrators, and teacher training schools. The teachers, as the new priesthood, must have their particular training, which is more than academic competence or a way with children. It is educational theory and experience. This is the power whose uncoiling may wield the spheres. A more dedicated and ambitious program for the new priesthood was hardly conceivable. The cause of education was not so much learning as indoctrination into a new way of life by state-trained teachers. In Connecticut, Henry Barnard's second annual report, 1839 to 1840, showed this condition among the common schools of that state. The studies pursued are spelling, reading, writing, and arithmetic. In all of the schools and the rudiments of geography, history, and grammar, in nearly all, bookkeeping, natural philosophy, astronomy, chemistry, algebra, geometry, surveying, and other branches are pursued to some extent. The main purpose of the educators was not mere learning, but taxation, teacher training, legal requirements for days of schooling, state supervision and guidance or supervision in matters of school architecture, textbooks, and the like. Much later, John Dewey was to insist that religion to flourish and be true must be a free and unforced flower of man's spirit. This concept neither he nor his predecessors ever found tolerable in relation to education. It had to be the forced and controlled flower of state-trained educators. The great early leader in educational circles was Henry Barnard, born on January the 24th, 1811, dying at 89 at his birthplace Hartford on July the 5th, 1900. Henry Barnard was the dedicated, self-sacrificing and crusading father of educational bureaucrats. Barnard, a central figure in 19th century education in the United States because of his extensive services and varied offices, is something of an embarrassment also. Whereas man in his day was accused of socialist ideas, Barnard was an ardent champion of capitalism and prepared a school catechism designed to demonstrate the social value of great profits by capitalists. Moreover, Barnard showed no commitment to any developed current philosophy of education, but was primarily, as a writer, a transmitter and mediator of contemporary educational theory, and as an educator and administrator rather than a thinker. What philosophy he held to is often better revealed in his practice than in his writings. Furthermore, Barnard held mildly to Orthodox Christianity, being a faithful Episcopalian. His faith permitted him to marry a Roman Catholic, and he allowed his children to be reared in that faith, and on neither point was he ever criticized, indicative of the radical divorce of Christianity and the political life which was then in process. Thus, no great religious zeal can be ascribed to him, nor did Christian doctrine dominate his thinking. It did, however, preserve him from the utopianism of many of his contemporaries. Horace Mann had shown marked tendencies in that direction, and only Mann's thorough acceptance of phrenology, in common for a time at least with William Ellery Channing, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walt Whitman, Charles Sumner, and Henry Ward Beecher, prevented him from believing that all men were equal in intellect and ability, and hence could be educated into equal capabilities. Men who had deserted biblical faith now substituted science in the form of phrenology for God as the source of unique differences in the potentialities of individuals. From this and other opinions of the day, Barnard was preserved by his earnest, if easy-going adherence to traditional Christianity. Finally, this absence of utopianism preserved Barnard from the radical adherence to various crusades of the day, which characterize others of the new school of educators. Neither phrenology, abolition, temperance, or any other crusade could deflect him from his central concern, education. Without being pro-slavery, Barnard kept strictly to his task and was thus equally respected in slave states and in the North. Barnard believed in creating a priesthood of teachers, and to this calling he gave his full allegiance. No other cause, however worthy, could command his attention or be allowed centrality in educational thinking. This fact, together with his religious and political conservatism, has made him somewhat less appealing than Mann to such historians as Merle Curti. Barnard began his educational career as a teacher in Wellsboro, Pennsylvania, 1830 to 1831, and then, after studying law, served as a member of the Connecticut legislature, 1837 to 1840, where he championed the cause of free schools. He became the first secretary of the Board of Commissioners of Common Schools in Connecticut, 1838 to 1842. The resistance to taxation for schools was widespread in the country, and taxation was introduced only with difficulty and sometimes political manoeuvring. In Connecticut, the situation was somewhat different. Not only was education required, as elsewhere, for the purposes of godly instruction, but a general property tax contributed to the support of schools. These schools, however, were, in a sense, a branch of the establishment, and the separation of church and state in 1818 detached the schools from parochial supervision and left them without supervision until the state assumed responsibility. This assumption was the consecrated responsibility of Henry Barnard. During the period of the church's establishment, the school had been religious in orientation. Barnard's purpose was to make its orientation statist. Thus, while no small amount of religion remained within the curriculum, the atmosphere and motive power of education was no longer Christian faith and life. It was instead life within the state and in the service of society. Summarizing Barnard's purpose, Curti has observed, education, in short, was to serve the actual needs of the community. The chief end of man shortly before this had been defined as glorifying God and enjoying Him forever. Now it was to glorify the community and enjoy life therein. A little earlier, James Madison, John Adams, and others had been sharp in their condemnation of democracy and emphatic in asserting that the Constitution established not a democracy, but a republic. Now the advocates of state-supported schools hailed the Connecticut state supervision as a major advance for democracy. Both friend and foe recognized its meaning. Democracy is on the advance. Barnard himself opposed the private school, not as Mann unwisely did, on its educational merits, but because it classifies society at the root, and thereby such schools open a real chasm between members of the same society, broad and deep, which equal laws and political theories cannot close. Not all the economic and religious conservatism of Barnard's thinking could overcome the radical implications of his educational theory. The central purpose of the schools was not learning as such, but learning in terms of living a common life in an unclassified society. Curtie is unhappy because so much of Barnard's humanitarian efforts and educational goals were in large part designed to remove the menace of a populace. But Barnard was a realist and saw the inadequacies of men. His goal was, nonetheless, a unified society. Reformed Christian faith had once been the bond between rich and poor, making them alike brothers in Christ and fellow priests in the commonwealth of God. This aspect of New England society was more or less gone, and its counterparts in other areas also disappearing. Barnard realized that a society without a common creed would become a battleground. The school must therefore supply the social cement for society by opposing stratification and classification and creating a common life. Not a socialistic common life was Barnard's ideal, but a common life as fellow members of a society, and whether capitalist or labourer, each man recognising his common cause with others. Accordingly, Barnard favoured the legal and required use of the Bible in schools and pointed to the noble effects produced even by imperfect observance of such laws. Christianity was not to be eliminated, it was to be used for the welfare of society and the control of the populace, not in any sinister sense, but to bring them faith, dignity, and moral stature. Man's life was religious, but not primarily religious, but rather societal, lived essentially within the state. Barnard was most appreciative of the role of the clergy of Sunday schools, their teachers, and their libraries. From no portion of the community have we received more cordial cooperation or more personal kindness in visiting different sections of the state. The church was no longer the unifying force in society. The state had taken its place, and in vast areas, the church was glad to be recognized as essential to the new society rather than an outsider to it. Like man, Barnard saw Protestantism as the source of freedom and liberty, but unlike man, he was more cordial to it and more broadly appreciative of its social necessity. For Barnard, this school was the true church in the new society, and every institution should nurture and promote that temple of society. Every schoolhouse should be a temple, consecrated in prayer to the physical, intellectual, and moral culture of every child in the community, and be associated in every heart with the earliest and strongest impressions of truth, justice, patriotism, and religion. The schoolhouse should be constructed throughout in a workmanlike manner. No public edifice more deserves or will better repay the skill, labour, and expense which may be necessary to attain this object, for here the health, tastes, manners, minds, and morals of each successive generation of children will be, in a great measure, determined for time and for eternity. As Brubaker has pointed out for Barnard, schools were agencies of social rejuvenation. Thus, education in the public school necessarily involved far more than mere book learning or subject matter mastery. Such things were mere knowledge and far short of the full scope of the school's purpose. If education was properly understood, if all the influences which go to mould and modify the physical, moral, and intellectual habits of a child were felt to be that child's education, parents and the public would not tolerate such schoolhouses with all their bad influences, indoors and out of doors, such imperfect and illiberal school arrangements in almost every particular, as are now found in a large majority of the school districts of the state. If they had a proper estimate of the influence of teachers, for good or for evil, for time and eternity on the character and destiny of their pupils, they would employ, if within the reach of their means, those best qualified to give strength and grace to the body, clearness, vigour, and richness to the mind, and the highest and purest feelings to the moral nature of every child entrusted to their care. If the ends of education were regarded, something more would be aimed at than to enable a child to read, write, and cipher, or to attain to any degree of mere knowledge. As far as the individual is concerned, it would be to secure the highest degree of health, powers of accurate observation and clear reflection, and noble feelings as far as the public is concerned, the prevention of vice and crime, and the keeping pure of the peace, order, and progress of society. Parents and society must be made to regard education in this light as their first concern, the common school as the chief instrumentality for accomplishing it, and the teacher as determining the character of the school. If this can be effected, the work of improvement will be begun in earnest and will not cease until such district school shall witness the triumphs of education. We should aim at something in common school education which is very apt to be missed in the college course, and perhaps no less frequently in private schools and academies. We mean a proper preparation for the real business of life. Barnard is thus quite plain spoken. The school, rather than church or home, is the chief instrumentality in the nurture of man's body, mind, and spirit. Indeed, the family should guide its table and fireside talk along lines intended to implement and further the school's teaching, according to Barnard. Education for living was the great task to which he summoned church, home, school, and society, with the school as its central institution and temple. Teachers, as has often been observed by scholars, were to Barnard the needed and true priesthood of man. Although Barnard's own faith was Christian immediately, the implications of his position were ultimately pragmatic and utilitarian in that education was both for living and essentially functional in character. Education, in its enlarged sense, is the disciplining, cultivating, and furnishing of the man as a man, and for the particular position which he is to hold. Barnard's next position was in Rhode Island as State Superintendent of Schools, 1843 to 1849, where he agreed to make history. Because Rhode Island had, unlike Connecticut, been established on the principle of religious liberty, it had been bitterly hostile to the establishment of church or school alike. State control of the schools was thus resisted. Barnard had, in his second annual report, 1840, in Connecticut, repeatedly asserted the prior right of the state to educate, as against the church and parents. He was thus the ideal man to institute a program of state control, which he successfully did. He then returned to Connecticut to become principal of New Britain Normal School, 1850 to 1854. Following this, he edited the American Journal of Education, giving it his major attention from 1855 to 1860, but publishing it from 1855 to 1881 at no small expense to himself. The journal exercised a decisive role in publicizing the new education and in transmitting foreign educational theory, and Barnard was not only a leader in his own right, but the great transmitter of his day. Many of the articles were subsequently reprinted in book form, as witness American Educational Biography, American Pedagogy, English Pedagogy, and others. Reverend Charles Brooks expressed his appreciation of the journal's work in a letter to Barnard, January the 28th, 1860. I think you should be canonized as the American education saint, or perhaps martyr. Brooks was not alone among clergymen in sharing his enthusiasm for statist education. The liberal clergy were solidly in favour of the new concept. For example, William Ellery Channing outdid the educators. Jesus had spoken, John 4:10, 7:38, of himself as the water of life, and believers, by union with him, as fountains of living water. Channing deliberately spoke of normal schools in the same language. An institution for training men to train the young would be a fountain of living waters, sending forth streams to refresh present and future ages. As yet, our legislators have denied to the poor and labouring classes this principal means of their elevation. We trust that they will not always prove blind to the highest interest of the state. Many clergymen, having forsaken orthodoxy and the historic concepts of the Church, had made state and school the new instruments of salvation and outdid educators in their assertions. From 1858 to 1860, Barnard served as Chancellor of the University of Wisconsin and agent of the Wisconsin Normal School Regents. The radical mismanagement of public school finances in that state did not disturb Barnard's faith in statist control. Then, as now, the proponents of the state are ready to blame outside forces for every corruption on the parts of the state. Among other things, Barnard urged more work in agricultural training on the part of the university as a means of enlisting farm support, as well as a step towards functionalism in education. Barnard's next position was in Maryland as president of St. John's College, 1866 to 1867, where his functional concept was again promoted. From 1867 to 1870, Barnard served as the first U.S. Commissioner of Education, where, despite hindrances, he quickly established a statistical survey of education in the States. Almost all the basic elements of modern school survey and supervision were foreshadowed or set forth in some aspect of Barnard's work. The office of Commissioner had been established with vague or little scope as a sop to educators lobbying for the nationalization of schools and the assumption of federal responsibility for them. Man had declared the Messianic character of education and had seen the hope of society in educational theory and experience so formulated. Therein was the power whose uncoiling may wield the spheres. To this task, Barnard, who later addressed man as my guide, my hope, my friend, my fellow labourer and fellow sufferer in the cause, dedicated himself. For them, their work was a holy crusade, and they willing martyrs in its cause. The sense of martyrdom in the face of any challenge or opposition had been characteristic of educators then and now, and is suggestive of the neurotic tendency that has often characterized religious ascetics and masochists. Man, for example, never hesitated to provoke people, but his response to criticism, as in the case of the Boston schoolmasters, was one of intense suffering. Man, upset by their criticism, asked Dr. Jarvis, "Can you do anything for a man's brain that has not slept for 3 weeks? I can feel the flame in the centre of my cranium flaring and flaring around just as you see that of a pile of brush burning on a distant heath in the wind. What can be done to extinguish it?" Barnard's attitude as U.S. Commissioner had often been provocative and presumptuous, in that he assumed that Congress was only an obstructionist agency and the work of the government less pressing or central than his own. Thus, very early, the typical educational neurosis and syndrome was established. Their enemies are vile opponents of progress and light, and cast hideous shadows. Whether well paid or not, whether commanding popularity or not, whether gaining unlimited funds or not, the educational administrator and bureaucrat has masochistically seen himself as the misunderstood, unloved, unappreciated, unrewarded, and bypassed prophet. As a class, they are, in their own eyes, the great misunderstood. Their real tragedy, however, usually occurs when they are all too well understood and their nature recognized and identified